My name is Peter Montiel. I'm a professor here at Williams. I was told that I should introduce myself. Jerry Caprio, who is an expert on bank regulation, says I should introduce myself. If that's not an example of moral hazard, I don't know what is. So I'll start out by telling you how wonderful I am. I'll skip that part. But I do want to tell you it's a real pleasure to be here with you. I've been looking forward to this weekend for a long time, to see some old friends. I've realized I've been here for 15 years, and a lot of you that have something on your little tags there, I'm sure have suffered through my class. So I'm very pleased to see so many old friends again, and I would like to welcome back those of you who were here before in 1995. It's a pleasure to meet you and to have you here, and it's a wonderful comment on the CDE how many of you have chosen to come back for this special occasion. I'm going to start out with some remarks, just some personal remarks, and then also a general background about the nature of this panel. And then I will introduce our four panelists and have them each speak for 10 or 15 minutes. And then I want to allow quite a bit of time for us to have a conversation together, for you to ask questions, and for this to be more interactive. So that's the plan for this session. Let me start with some personal comments, like I said. I came to Williams 15 years ago, and I was told about Williams and sort of recruited to Williams by Henry Bruton and Cappy Hill. Now, you all know Henry, so I don't have to tell you about Henry, and you've just seen Cappy. And you can imagine how charming it was to be told about this great place by those two wonderful people. So it was really a privilege to come to Williams. But to be very frank with you, what really I found most attractive about Williams was the opportunity to come and teach at the center. For me, teaching at the center and interacting with all of you was something that made Williams an extremely attractive place to spend hopefully the rest of my professional career. And in the 15 years that I've been here, it has not been disappointing. I have looked forward to that CDE class every single time I've walked into it, and I have had a good time every single time I've walked into it. So I feel privileged to be a part of this. And I know that the rest of the faculty who teach at the center feel the same way. Cappy made a reference earlier today to Henry retiring often. And indeed, in my first year here, Henry took me out to dinner to celebrate his grading of his final exam. I think that was about 5 or 6 years before he ultimately did sort of retire. But he actually retired on my watch when I was chair of the center. Or at least he taught his last economic development full class while I was chair. And one of the things that I always valued about Henry was precisely his keenness on questioning and on searching and learning, as I'm sure all of you will remember very well. And this is something that I think is an indispensable part of a liberal arts education, and why it's so important to have people from all over the developing world come to Williams and be exposed to this little gem of American higher education. Henry certainly impressed me as much as I expected that he would, and I thought that it would be a shame not to have future generations of CDE students not be exposed to Henry. So if they couldn't have him in the classroom, one of the things that I thought I would do was create a Friday tea time session where Henry could come and meet the students. And since I very much admire Henry, I would come to all those tea time sessions. And of course, Henry did what Henry does, which is to raise questions and more questions. And I always left those tea time sessions tremendously frustrated because I wanted answers, right? It's probably my background. I spent a lot of my career at the IMF and the World Bank, so I come from the policy world. And I know that policymakers want answers. So one of the things that I have tried to do while I'm here at the center is to insist on asking questions, but also coming up with some answers. And to specifically have the students think about how we come up with answers in economics. In today's session, I really want to be about some answers. Now, this session is about macroeconomics. So for those of you who are familiar with macro, it's more than a little ironic to say we're going to look for answers in macro. Because, as the joke that Michelle told today about lining up X number of economists, end on end, you never reach a conclusion, or X is some large number, well, you could line up 10X macroeconomists and still never reach anything close to a conclusion. Nonetheless, policymakers need answers. So in particular, this session is going to be about some answers about macroeconomic issues in developing countries. This is the macro panel. Now, this panel, I think, is particularly important, particularly relevant as a celebration of the CDE's 50th anniversary, because I think we do have at least some tentative answers, and humility is very much on the table here. This macro session coincides with the Great Recession, which we've been living through for the past 3 years. And this particular recession has been one that has seen some fundamental changes, in my opinion, in the macroeconomic environment in developing countries. In particular, there have been some changes in the macro policy environment, in the macro institutional environment. In many ways, in the area of macroeconomics anyway, it's a brave new world in developing countries, or at least it may be a brave new world. This is where the humility comes in. And this change in the macro environment may also have important implications for the governance of the international economy as a whole. So I'd like to focus a little bit on that in today's panel. So what change am I talking about? Well, I'm originally from Latin America. And in Latin America, it used to be said that when the United States sneezed, Latin American countries would catch pneumonia. And this was quite true, because any macroeconomic fluctuation in the United States tended to be magnified dramatically in Latin America, and the same could be said for much of the rest of the world. We have the lost decade of Latin America of the 1980s, triggered by the Volcker disinflation in the United States. We had the 2001 recession that was associated with the bursting of the dot-com bubble, which also created recessions throughout the developing world. And in all of these cases, and many others that we could talk about, recovery from those recessions in developing countries had to wait for recovery in industrial countries. The boosting of exports from the recovering industrial country markets was one of the ways that developing countries came back from their own recessions. But this time is different. To quote the name of a well-known book by Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, but this time that was a tongue-in-cheek, that was a cynical title. I'm serious. This time it's different. The Great Recession has been different. Why? It's not that developing countries didn't catch pneumonia when the industrial world sneezed. They did. They were hit very hard by this recession. But this recession lingers in the industrial countries, and recovery is well underway in emerging and developing countries. This is something new. This is something different. It's not that developing world countries, like I said, have not been hit as hard, but they have begun to recover much more quickly, and more importantly, their recovery has not been dependent on recovery in the OECD countries, in the industrial countries. Just to give you some numbers. The IMF just put out its World Economic Outlook for its annual meetings. Growth in the United States in 2010 is projected to be about 2.6%, 2.3% for 2011. I never have figured out after 10 years at the fund how they come up with those decimals, but there you have it. In any case, low and continuing to be low. In the Eurozone, the fund projects 1.7% for 2010, 1.5% for 2011. By contrast, in China, for 2010, growth is projected at 10.5%, over 9.5% in 2011. In Brazil, 7.5% this year, over 4% next year. A very different scenario. Now, it's true that these countries were also growing more quickly before the recession hit, but these countries have gone back to the pre-recession growth rates, and those were boom years from 2003 to 2007. Not true for the United States, for Western Europe, for Japan, and many industrial countries. The question is, why? Why is it different this time? Why is it that the links seem to be working in a very different way? That's really what I'd love to have us talk about as a group this afternoon. Let me offer 4 different hypotheses, because like I said, we want answers here. And let me list them in order of increasing plausibility, at least to me. Okay? So I'll begin with the ones that I think are less plausible and finish with the one that I actually happen to believe. The first hypothesis to explain this is that maybe just emerging economies are now much larger than they used to be. Right? They're now much carry much bigger weight in the world than they used to. So maybe they no longer need to be pulled along by the US locomotive. That's not so plausible because developing and emerging economies are still a small percentage of the world economy. Even though China may be number 2 now, it's still a far distant number 2. So the weight of these countries, while it has been increasing over time, remains rather small. A second hypothesis, one which is very popular in the United States, no matter which administration is in Washington, is that perhaps emerging economies have grown faster by stealing demand from industrial countries. Maybe what's really going on is that these so-called undervalued real exchange rates, something which I'm not sure I know what it means, have enabled developing countries to basically outcompete the industrial countries. So maybe they're growing so fast because we are growing so slow. This is only second in my list of potential answers. Third, a little more sophisticated answer is that even though China and India are still relatively small countries in the world economy, they are not large enough to be the locomotives for the world economy on their own. Especially China's growth is extremely commodity intensive. So when you have a country which is significant in size and is commodity intensive in its growth, that boosts commodity prices. So even if the rest of the world hasn't changed, even if the rest of the developing world hasn't changed, the fact that it's China that's growing fast makes commodity prices be high, and that benefits commodity exporting countries. Maybe that's why they're doing relatively well. That's a third hypothesis. The final hypothesis, which I'll mention, is that something big happened in emerging and emerging and developing countries during the decade of the 1990s and the 2000s, and that is that the institutional and policy environment for macroeconomics has changed. It's changed partly because of reforms that many countries began to implement in the 1990s, and partly, and I think importantly, as a result of lessons learned from the Asian crisis in 1997-1998. As a result of these experiences, many countries have undertaken reforms of the following types. They have more robust financial sectors. They have more independent central banks with strong anti-inflationary track records. They have more flexible exchange rates. They have much larger stocks of foreign exchange reserves. They have more responsible fiscal policies with less public sector debt. For all these reasons, this time has been different in the sense that developing countries and emerging economies have responded to the crisis not pro-cyclically, but anti-cyclically. In other words, they have tried to stimulate their own economies, not aggravated the recession by tightening monetary policy and cutting back on fiscal policy. So, if the last hypothesis happens to be true, and we'll find out from our panelists, hopefully, and from you, whether you think it's the main part of the explanation, this tells us that there has indeed been an important payoff to macroeconomic policy reform. This was a debated issue in the 1990s when people said, where's the growth payoff? Couldn't find any. Maybe the payoff isn't so much in terms of growth, but it's in terms of resiliency, of stability in the face of external shocks, and therefore more macroeconomic stability generally. So I put this hypothesis out to you, and now I'm going to turn the floor over to our panelists. I would like for us as a group to, and the panelists are not committed to answering these questions, but I would like for us as a group to consider the following questions as we talk. First, are any of these hypotheses right, or is there another explanation? Maybe in your mind you've already said, hey, what happened to Montiel? He forgot X. Great, tell us about it in the question and answer part. Second, has the policy environment in the emerging and developing countries really changed? Has there been a fundamental change? Third, if it has, then why did it happen? What were the most important changes? Why did they come about? It's not so easy to bring about fundamental change in macro institutions and in the policy framework. So if they really did change, what caused it? And finally, what are the implications of these changes for the world economy and for the governance of the international monetary system in particular? Okay? So those are the questions. Now, here are the people that are going to tell us some things that will be relevant for this. The first speaker will be Gary Teves. He's from CDE class of 1968. Mr. Teves served as Secretary of Finance, basically a Minister of Finance for the Philippines from July 2005 to 2010. Which was the longest tenure in that position in the Philippines for more than 20 years. He was recently honored by the Banker magazine as Asia's Finance Minister of the Year in 2009, so he's very well placed to talk about these issues. He's also was the CEO and president of Land Bank, which is a public sector agricultural lender before that. And he was a congressman for the maximum of 3 terms in the Philippines from 1987 to 1998. Our second speaker will be Eduardo Conesa, class of 1969, second from your left here. Eduardo began his career in Argentina's public administration. He received an MA from Williams, and like I said, in 1969. He got a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania in 1982. He worked as an economist at the World Bank. Since 1986, he has been in the Faculty of Economics, Faculty of Law, teaching economics at the University of Buenos Aires. And he has published a number of books. Argentina is a country which lends itself to publishing many books, and he has taken full advantage because they have a rich macroeconomic history, and he's on record with a lot of that history. Our fourth speaker will be Ishrat Husain. He's third from your left. Ishrat Husain was from the class of 72. He got his PhD from Boston University in 1978. After that, he went to the World Bank, was an economist there, focused on West Africa. He stayed at the bank for 20 years, where I overlapped with him briefly, and worked in many different geographic areas of the bank. In 1999, he was appointed the governor of the State Bank of Pakistan, which is Pakistan's central bank, and remained in that position over 2005. He is widely credited with turning the state bank's performance around and boosting the professional morale of its staff. And thanks to Ishrat, we've had some outstanding students here from the State Bank of Pakistan. From 2006 to 2008, he served as chairman of the National Commission in Pakistan, reporting directly to the Prime Minister and with the mandate to reform the civil service. The question of governance is vital. He has since been in academia. He's the dean and director of the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, which is the oldest graduate business school in all of Asia. Finally, directly on my left, I smile at her because she's my former student. It's very nice to see her again. Eteri Kvintradze from Georgia. Eteri got her degree from CDE in 1999, and she got a PhD from Georgetown University. She had Edwin Muskie's fellowships for both degrees. She has served as Deputy Minister of Finance for Georgia and as advisor to the Executive Director at the World Bank. More recently, she has been on the staff at the International Monetary Fund, and she has worked on Mozambique, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. She is currently the resident representative of the fund in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And I was teasing her before we started that she is the new face of the kinder and gentler International Monetary Fund. Welcome to all of you. Welcome to, is she kind and gentle? Anyway, welcome to all of you. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I turn the floor over to Gary Teves.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. I have a number of slides here. I'm aware that we should speak for only 10 to 15 minutes. I'll try to have the discipline, even if I was a former politician. No. Actually, I should have read carefully the note of Peter that there are specific questions that he raised, and I could have just said yes to all of them, and then my presentation is finished. No. But then I guess some of you might want to hear more about how we did it and what else should be done in the next few years to even withstand a severe crisis as what we have experienced in recent years. So what I will try to do is I will go over the charts and as quickly as we can for most of the charts, and try to slow down on some charts that are more important. So let me begin with the economy, the Philippine economy. In 2007, we were doing very well. In fact, it was considered one of the best years in the Philippine economy in this decade. But then, of course, everybody knew that we had the commodity prices going up in 2008 the global financial crisis in the last quarter of 2008, all the way down to the middle of 2009. And in the case of the Philippines, we also suffered another severe setback. We had two major typhoons in late 2009, which caused a lot of harm to our economy. But then, as Peter said, we were fortunate, as most emerging economies, especially in Asia, after the Asian financial crisis. We put in these reforms earlier, beginning with the financial reforms, later with the fiscal reforms, which I will explain earlier. And as most countries, we're committed to continue with our goal of poverty reduction and meeting the targets under the Millennium Development Goals for as much as we can. And then we will try to do much more over the next few years under the new administration. This is an illustration of how these reforms affected growth. You will see in the chart in 2007, we grew by 7.1%, with a fairly decent growth earlier. Then came the beginning of the difficulties, the crises. So we suffered with a growth rate of only 1.1% in 2009. We were fortunate that we didn't suffer a recession. We were fortunate, which is again peculiar in the case of the Philippine economy, that not only these reforms took place earlier, but we were consistently supported by the contributions of our overseas Filipino workers. They contribute about 8 to 9% of our economy. And then the rebound, as again pointed out by Peter, for the first 2 quarters of 2010, the economy grew by about 7.5%. And many economists and international institutions suggest that we could probably grow by about anywhere between 6 to 7, even more than that. These are the sources of growth in 2007 on the expenditure side and on the income side. And services is particularly a very significant sector for the economy. So unlike many other countries, industrial and developing ones, services would consist a very important component in our economy. We have also started diversifying our exports early, and that's the reason why we also didn't suffer very much. When China began to really emerge as one of the growth countries in the world, we were fortunate that proximity plus complementation allowed us to increase our reliance in other countries like China and reduce our reliance on the United States and Europe. Although we have suffered a decline in the share of capital goods imports, as I said earlier, the services sector is the one that's really dominating the Philippine economy. And in recent years, the contribution of the agricultural sector has improved from 2% in the previous decades to about 4% a year. The favorable trends in 2007 also contributed to the following favorable results. The deficit of the national government as a percent of GDP dropped to around 1%, while the consolidated public sector posted a surplus. Tax revenue still was quite a challenge to us. We fell below target, and it would still be considered a key risk to our macro stability. We are fortunate to have a number of assets of the government that we were able to sell, and this also contributed to non-tax revenues. These factors also contributed to the improvement in the peso in relation to the dollar, and this resulted in a reduction in our debt service payment. It was also during this time that we had an upgrade from Moody's from negative to stable, and that also helped us in the credit market. The macro environment being favorable also contributed to low inflation. The financial system was geared for expansion with a large amount of credit available and the NPL ratio declining. And all of these indicators show that the Philippines is a better position to weather financial volatilities. I wasn't able to put in the latest figures, but I can show them later. No. These are some of the indicators that show that the Philippines is really in a better position to weather global volatilities. Declining inflation, declining 91 T-bill rates. The peso, although 47.6 in 2009, is about 42 pesos now in relation to the dollar. The bank lending rate has also been declining. I mentioned this already. Total factor productivity is still not very high in relation to other ASEAN countries, but continuously improving over time. We still lack capital formation, and we lag behind other countries, and this will be explained in subsequent charts. The high growth in 2007 took place despite declining levels because we also had low levels of capacity utilization, which provided headroom for expansion and the increasing dominance of the service sector. Our manufacturing was operating at only 80% utilization rate. This, we can probably go a little slower. We have a combination of banking reforms right after the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, together with the monetary reforms, and the fiscal reforms came a little later. And these were the examples of monetary reforms. The central bank allowed the peso to freely seek its own level. The central bank raised the liquidity reserves of banks to channel their excess liquidity into treasury instruments, and we started adopting inflation targeting in 2002. The banking reforms included the passage of the General Banking Law of 2000, and the passage of the Special Purpose Vehicle, which was a mechanism for the disposal of non-performing loans and improve the asset quality of banks and reduce the problem assets of the banking systems to manageable levels. The central bank also enhanced the corporate governance standards by instituting safeguards against excessive risk-taking, ensuring fair exercise of business transaction, promoting consumer protection, and making the board of the directors fully accountable to its shareholders and the public. This was the most important fiscal reform that took place in recent years. We expanded the value-added tax from 10% to 12%. And we also broadened the coverage of the VAT to include, among others, power and electric cooperatives, as well as petroleum products. And as a result, the tax revenues of the government improved at an average of 1% of GDP annually. Despite that, we still lack the attractiveness needed to sustain our economy, and we will go into this later. We lack capital compared to other countries like Vietnam and Indonesia. We still need to provide more infrastructure facilities. Most of our infrastructure facilities are concentrated in Luzon and in Metro Manila. So there's been an imbalance in our economic growth. We have 3 major islands in the Philippines, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. These inadequacies in infrastructure have a large impact on the cost of doing business, so we're not yet that competitive. We lack transportation and the transport network, and our electricity is one of the highest in Asia. Much as needs to be done in the area of reducing poverty and inequality in income distribution. You will note in the chart that among the various regions, among the various regional components in the Philippines, only 4 experience poverty incidence of less than 40%. And high inequality can expose institutions to what we call political capture. We still have a long way to go to achieve our Millennium Development Goals, and we need to improve in the following areas, particularly in achieving universal primary education, improving maternal health, and increasing access to reproductive health services. And one of the things that we would normally ask is what has been the reaction of the legislature to the global financial crisis. I guess they reacted almost similarly to other countries, in the sense that in the case of the Philippines, they decided to provide more tax relief and what we call revenue eroding measures. These are some of the measures that unfortunately brought about an erosion in our revenues. The more significant ones are the individual income tax relief, totaling about 81 to 86 billion pesos, practically eroding the gains of the expanded value-added tax. So we were fortunate that we had this growth. We saw the growth declining to a low of 1.1%. So we need to continue with the reforms to be able to withstand future shocks. So under the fiscal reforms, we still need to continue with our improvement in tax revenues. We also have to be vigilant in our spending and borrowings. And we need to allocate more resources for infrastructure to attract investments and to accelerate growth in other areas other than Metro Manila and Luzon. And we need to continue with governance reforms. So moving forward, these are some of the reforms that we need to work on, and I hope the legislature will act on some of these reforms. These are the excise tax reforms, or what we call sin taxes. We have still one of the lowest tax rates for cigarettes and alcohol products in Asia, where economists normally like to continue raising the value-added tax, but at the same time consider lowering income tax rates. We also need to generate more revenues from self-employed individuals, so we would like to simplify the system of taxing business income earning individuals. There needs to be another look at the Central Bank Act. I will discuss that perhaps in the open forum. Certain amendments to improve the supervisory functions of the central bank. And we need to strengthen the anti-money laundering law to allow us to generate more revenues, especially from individuals, and at the same time increase our tax effort. These are some of the things I mentioned earlier. I wanted to also mention the rationalization of fiscal incentives. We have a lot of what we call redundant incentives given to certain sectors that do not need these incentives. So we'd like to channel them to areas where they're mostly needed and use the saving to provide more infrastructure facilities. These reforms or measures will be able to generate an additional 0.5 to 0.8% of GDP. And finally, capital market reforms to mobilize savings. We need to make long-term savings more attractive and be able to use these savings to finance many of our infrastructure facilities. And one of these also is pursuing the financial sector tax neutrality reform to provide or promote level playing field for financial institutions and instruments to encourage savings and investments. So this is the summary of our presentation. We need to continue towards the path of fiscal consolidations. More resources are needed for accelerated infra development and better social services to allow us to improve resilience to withstand future shocks and overcome challenges in the future. So there you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, I would like to thank the authorities of the Center for Development Economics for this brilliant organization of the 50th anniversary, and of course, for the honor of inviting me to be a speaker. When I attended the first class immediately after my arrival at the Center of Development Economics back in 1968, 42 years ago, the case study to be discussed in class was the foreign exchange gap and the distortions to the economy generated by the Argentine currency overvaluation of 1948-1954. Professor John Sheehan commentaries and the later discussion paper Import Substitution as a Development Strategy, written by Henry Bruton, were demolishing and brilliant. In fact, all Professor R. Williams were able to present to the class case studies where development issues such as comparative advantage, shadow prices, competitive equilibrium, cost-benefit analysis, resource allocation, and even simple econometrics were presented with impressive vitality, freshness, and force in a way that I never saw again, even though I later had the opportunity to review many of those concepts in such renowned places such as Penn and Harvard. My first contact with the Williams approach to development economics impressed me so much that I decided to focus heavily on the subject in my subsequent studies. During the 80s, the Argentine economy experienced the maladies of a 20% drop in GDP per capita, 20% drop in GDP per capita, and a hyperinflation that reached the rate of 4,982% for the year 1989. Those disasters set the stage for important policy reforms. The public strongly advocated for them. Moreover, the timing of the collapse of the Argentine economy coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 1989, the glory of the most extreme liberal capitalism was at its pinnacle. Thus, Milton Friedman's simple policy recommendations of privatize, and privatize were assumed by President Menem and his Minister of Finance Dr. Domingo Cavallo, a Harvard PhD. And in fact, many of those actions gave successful results. Public services and utilities became efficient after 2 or 3 years. And more importantly, the inflation rate dropped to 2% per year only, immediately. But 2 fatal and important flaws were committed in the whole process of policy reforms. The first was the fixing of the exchange rate forever, as in the gold standard, by law of Congress, at a level that in real terms was half of its equilibrium rate. In other words, the equilibrium rate of exchange was 2 pesos per dollar, but the new law of Congress enacted 1:1 to the dollar. As in the gold standard, the central bank could issue only 1 peso to the extent that it could buy $1. Instead of the gold standard of the 19th century, we experienced with an equally rigid dollar standard. In fact, the Argentine monetary system enforced during the 1991-2001 has been inspired not by Milton Friedman, but in the theory of the supply-side economics. This theory, sponsored by economists like Robert Mundell, Arthur Laffer, and Robert Barro, holds that the true cause of inflation is the currency devaluation. So, in order to fight inflation, supply-siders advise keeping the nominal exchange rate fixed. Moreover, in order to make a stronger point, inducing rational expectations about the future, the fixing of the exchange rate must be established by law of Congress, as referred previously. Obviously, also, the Barro-Ricardian theory on fiscal deficit was adopted. That meant that if the government went into debt, the wise and rational private sector would save, compensating for the government deficits. Thus, the government issued abundant foreign debt for the dual purposes of providing dollars to the central bank to finance the balance of payment deficits, and at the same time, those dollars converted into newly issued pesos served the purpose of financing the fiscal deficit. The expansive effect of fiscal deficit covered through external debt was essential to counteract the depressing effects on economic activity of currency overvaluation. The inevitable result of these policies was an ever-growing external debt, very large balance of payment deficits, high interest rates, and worst of all, unemployment rates of 20% that, when added with underemployment, both together reached up to 40%. Thus, the social unrest generated by supply-side economics became so high that they brought about the resignation of President de la Rúa back in December of 2001. But in early 1991, not only supply-siders were able to convince Congress for fixing forever the nominal exchange rate by law, additionally, they legally encouraged the expansion of local dollar deposits and lending in dollars to local people and enterprises, when in fact they received their income in pesos, the local money supply. This institutional setup implied that Argentina had no lender of last resort for its local economy from 1991 to 2001, simply because the Argentinian central bank could not issue dollars. It could only issue and lend pesos to the banking system. but the banking system had legally to pay back their deposits in dollars. Interesting enough, the finance ministers and central bank governors that advised President Menem and De La Rúa to implement this kind of gold standard plus local dollar deposits were all graduated as a PhDs in Harvard, Minnesota, or Chicago. Then after this, no one holding a title of Harvard, Minnesota, or Chicago will ever be Minister of Finance in Argentina. Based on the Williams body of economic policy thinking, which recommended a careful setting of the big macroeconomic prices, such as the exchange rate, the interest rate, and the wage rate as a basis for long-term economic growth, I wrote and published at the time more than 100 newspaper articles and 4 books criticizing the new supply-side economics after year 1991. Unfortunately, for almost 10 years, I was a vox clamantis in deserto. I was speaking loudly, but to the Sahara Desert. I thought that Mr. Cavallo and his flock of 100 economists should have attended Williams before going to Harvard or Chicago. If that had been the case, they would not have advice for the currency overvaluation and for local dollar bank deposits. As I said before, all these policies ended up in 2001 in a 10% drop in GDP, 40% of unemployment, a default of external debt. In addition, since Mr. Cavallo was again the finance minister in 2001, the bomb he designed exploded in his own hands. So it is very important what was said previously in this conference about humility. Humility. At the beginning of 2002, a new president, Mr. Eduardo was appointed by Congress. His Minister of Finance, Mr. Roberto Lavagna, set a competitive exchange rate accompanied by managed floating. In addition, he was able to implement a policy of strong fiscal surpluses. Moreover, he conveniently renegotiated our external debt. That combination of policies worked wonders in terms of economic growth rates and employment, lasting up to early 2007, including part of the first term of the newly elected president, Néstor Kirchner. Unfortunately, those judicious policies were abandoned early in 2007. At the time, year 2007, a new brand of populism destroyed the cost of living index to hide the new inflation brought about by the policy of salary increases not accompanied by increased productivity. The exchange rate became no longer competitive because it had been eroded by the growing inflation. As you can see, the mania of fighting inflation by keeping the nominal exchange rate almost constant emerged again and again, as if the supply-siders were newly in power. Public utility rates were fixed also at wrong levels, covering only 30% of the cost. Unfortunately, a new economic crisis may result in year 2012, and growth may take again the traditional pattern of stop and go. As you can see, the economic cycle in Argentina keeps no major connection with the US cycle. Now, in year 2010, the growth rate will be 9%. Probably the growth rate in 2011 will be 4%. In 2009, we had a drop, not revealed by the official statistic, but by the true statistics, of minus 3%. Our economy now is more connected with the Chinese economy, because our economy exports a lot of soybeans and grain to China. And since China has a tremendous growth rate, the demand for food and foodstuff keeps our prices, the prices of our exports, very high, and this helps very much our economy. So our cycle is rather independent of the US one. But blaming only the economic policies of the last 20 years for Argentina's backwardness today, in 2010, would be reductionism. In the second half of the 20th century, Argentina tried with many economic policies, in fact, too many, and in few occasions they were the right ones. The true deep cause of our decadence is the so-called spoil system in public administration. Argentina has a type of Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson was a president of the United States in the 19th century, supporting the wrong theory that the political party winning the elections should provide all public administration jobs, even the mailman. But finally, at the end of the 19th century, the US rejected the spoil system with the enactment of the Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which established a merit system for appointment. But in Argentina, a special type of spoil system was established in the 20th century, and it is still in force. The president elected by popular vote has the right to appoint his own people in all public administration jobs. He can appoint not only his minister, which is obvious, but also directors and deputy directors and even all menial public jobs. And especially, he is careful in appointing the financial director of each ministry. In Argentina, there is no strict professional civil service appointed through examinations and promoted through long-term careers. A stable civil service based on merit is key to obtain long-term state policies, to promote human capital formation, and for institution building. That occurs in all developed countries. The opposite, the spoil system, is the sure path to decadence. As a result of the spoil system, is that the politician tackling the presidency has a complete control of the public administration budget, so he can use public money to keep himself or his own cronies, or even his wife, always in power. The result of the spoil system was that all presidents tried to perpetuate his power simply because the treasury of the public budget, which is about $100 billion, is such a large gift that it cannot and should not be donated to the opposing party. Thus, the Republican-Democratic alternancy in politics becomes extremely difficult. Then, under the spoil system, fraud in elections to keep the incumbent in power may occur. The fraud could adopt many forms, such as changing the ballot boxes, altering the election date, appointing too many cronies, giving a general rise in salaries the months previous to the election day, or controlling newspapers, televisions, and the media in general. Fortunately, there is a growing awareness of the necessity of resolving these problems in today's Argentina's politics. Many presidential candidates for the 2011 elections have promised to tackle the issue. If Argentina were to resolve this problem, she could easily regain her old position among the 10 more developed countries as the one she had 100 years ago, back in 1910. Thank you very much.
First of all, let me thank Peter, Montiel, Tom Powers, Jerry Caprio for inviting me to this panel. I'm delighted to be back in Williams College and to see the young men and women who are going through the same ordeal we used to go through. And I can assure you that you will be much better off after Williams than if you had never attended Williams. Let me focus on the main question which was assigned to the panel and give my own interpretation and reading of the evidence, although it is too early to pronounce a definitive judgment on this particular episode of 2007 to 2009. Why is it that only after such a brief spell of a few quarters decline in the emerging and developing economies, they have performed so well, unemployment has been contained, and the stimulus package, which has been applied very modestly but very sporadically, has done the trick as compared to what is happening in the United States, the Eurozone, and even worse situation in Japan. I would like to caution that the variation across the countries in this large sample of the emerging and developing economy is quite significant. And the large emerging and developing economies, such as China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia, are the leaders of the pack. But I'm also very delighted that having been the chief economist of West Africa region in the 1990s, and I was very much frustrated by the slow growth of Africa, that even sub-Saharan Africa is doing extremely well in the aftermath of this crisis. So it is widespread. It is not confined only to the large countries, but it is quite widespread. I, for one, do not still believe in the decoupling hypothesis, because if you look at the transmission mechanism from the disturbances in the financial sector to the real economy across the borders, these were very, very powerful. These were quite swift, and they were quite intense for some countries. Although the macroeconomic environment and the fundamentals in several of these countries did not actually necessitate these kind of transmission mechanisms to be automatically absorbed. So I still think that those who believe that decoupling has taken place are not justified from this evidence of 2007-2009. There may be a different kind of coupling which is taking place as the balance of economic power is shifting from the developed countries to the developing economies. The shocks in the developing countries over time may have a much more pronounced transmission effect on the health of the developed countries. And that is something which we do not know for sure, but which is something which the development economists have to watch out for. Even before the crisis, as Peter pointed out, their share of the EDEs was 31%, and it was only 17% in 1990. To double this share within a period of 15 to 16 years is a very remarkable achievement in a very expanding economy. But what is more significant is that the contribution of the EDEs into the GDP growth of the globe had risen from 50% to 65%. So who is actually driving the engine of the global growth? It is coming consistently from the EDEs and not from the advanced countries. Now, I concede to Peter that yes, structural reforms which were carried out in the last decade, sound macroeconomic management, favorable demographics, and the absorption of innovation to extend the production frontiers in these economies have all contributed to the robustness of the growth. So unlike the cyclical factors, which only the fiscal stimulus or the monetary policy accommodation are driving the growth, which may prove to be transitory, in case of the EDEs, these were the structural changes. And why did they come about? They came about for a variety of reasons. The Latin American countries had a bitter experience of the 1990s, which was a lost decade. The Asian countries had a very tough experience in the 1905 to 97, where both in human misery as well as the output growth was a tremendous shock. And then people learned from these two lessons, which they had to incorporate in their own development thinking. And the Malaysian case, where contrary to the IMF's advice, the Malaysians imposed their fixed exchange rate, capital controls, and everything which was against the advice of the IMF, and did very well, started a new thinking among the policymakers that the solutions which were prescribed by the Washington Consensus may not always be appropriate for their own welfare. So these were the conditions which led to the reserves accumulation. And by that time, China, a new kid on the block, had demonstrated that unfettered liberalization does not really do the trick. And that is what South Asian countries did very well after the Asian crisis, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because we were following what I call as a cautious liberalization. We had partial capital controls. We didn't have a complete capital account convertibility. We had very much a managed float. It was not a complete independent exchange rate. And a very strong regulatory oversight of the banking system with an independent, strong, professionally run central banks. So if you look at the history of the 1990s, the South Asian countries escaped all this crisis because we were not open like Indonesia, where the Singapore market was shorting the Indonesian rupiah and created havoc, which led to the Korean won and Thai baht. So I personally think that the Chinese experiment, because China was growing very well, South Asia was not a big player at that time, also followed or actually was in the same strain. That convinced many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to go for the managed float, for partial capital controls, for not full capital convertibility, for a strong regulatory framework, for independent central bank with greater powers to exercise on the monetary policy, exchange rate, and on the relationship between the fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So my submission is that we should look at this experience of the cautious liberalization. Second, as I said, the banking system was a dominant part of the financial sector in the EDEs, which were funded through bank deposits. and not through the capital markets or the wholesale funding. That's a critical distinction between the Western countries and the EDEs. Household debt, even in a average EDE, was not more than 3 to 4% of GDP. And the mortgage penetration in a country as wide as big as India was only 6%, while in the US, mortgage penetration was 75% of GDP and 60% for all developed countries. So if you keep the banking system, both on the asset side and the liability side, not so much out of sync with the mismatch, then this keeps the banking system, which is the predominant sector component of the financial sector, that avoids the crisis situation. China had stripped its non-performing assets well before this crisis of 2007 and 8 and gave them over to asset management companies. So the balance sheets of the Chinese banks were completely free from all contamination or toxic assets. India, at the same time, did exactly the same thing, that they tried to get rid of the non-performing assets. We in Pakistan also brought down our non-performing assets from 25% of the total loans to 5%. And by extensive provisioning, we were able to bring the net NPLs down to 3%, which made the banks quite immune from the toxic assets. Then the capital adequacy ratios were not 8% as prescribed by Basel, but most of the Asian countries, they were hovering around 12 to 18%. So there were capital buffers and the cushions which were able to take care of some of these shocks. In fact, the profits of the Chinese banks, after they stripped the NPLs, increased by 17-fold. And they used that profit in order to build up the balance sheets and recapitalize the banks. And this cleaning up, I think, was the second important factor as far as the impact of this global financial crisis was concerned. The third point I would like to raise is that we did not have such kind of derivatives, exotic products, and securitization, where the link between the originator and the distributor was completely severed. One of the difficulties, and I submitted this at the World Banking Congress to the Federal Reserve in January 2007, is that the banks' incentive structure has become quite perverse for the simple reason that if they were holding the mortgage loans on their balance sheets, then they would make adequate due diligence of the portfolio and make sure that the cash flows are coming in. By slice and dice and selling the tranches to the people who do not understand what the content of these mortgage securitized assets are, they strip themselves off the due diligence. And because those guys didn't know what they were getting into, this particular subprime mortgage was the origin of the crisis. And this can be attributed to the regulator sleeping on the wheels and not taking care of this perverse incentive structure which was created in the banking sector. The fourth point I would like to submit is that the developing countries had made adequate social safety nets. Remember, in Indonesia, the poverty had almost doubled after the Asian crisis. Therefore, each one of these countries had to take social safety nets. In India, has a credit guarantee fund for micro, small, and medium enterprises, an export rate subsidy that provided bank loans at below the market lending rates in terms of the crisis, a national rural employment guarantee scheme. In Brazil, Bolsa Familia was able to lift 12 million people out of poverty while it covered 55 million of the poor population. In China, between 2000 and 2008, because its GDP had quadrupled, the exports were raised 5 times. Tens of millions of new jobs were created in the urban areas from the rural population migration, gave a great deal of security and income stability to these people. And the one thing which Mexico, Argentina, and other Latin American countries have done very well are the conditional cash transfers, which cushion them on the impact of the vulnerable citizens. We discussed this in Asian Development Bank, and our conclusion was that there was no mass unemployment or mass poverty due to the impact of the crisis. Some of the $2 per day poor were affected, but not the $1.25 per day poor. Secondly, there was some problems with the urban educated youth, women in export sector, migrants and children, but other segments were insulated from the impact of this crisis. And finally, I would say that the foreign exchange reserve accumulation was a powerful safeguard against the onslaught of the speculators. I cannot imagine if there were not such high foreign exchange reserves in the Asian developing countries, they would be shorted by the currency speculators, and we would have a replay of the 1997 crisis. The fact that they knew that the central banks can come in with huge ammunition against their onslaught was one of the major reasons why the Asian countries were not hit so hard. So these are the 5 or 6 of the lessons which I would submit in answer to Peter's questions were the reasons why the emerging and developing countries have done so well. It is too early. I just came from the IMF World Bank meetings. The capital controls are being talked about because the interest rates being so low in the United States are pushing capital to the emerging and developing countries, creating appreciation of the exchange rate, and therefore eroding the export competitiveness. This can lead to adverse circumstances, either protectionism or some kind of controls. This is a major worry for the policymakers in the developing countries. Then you are always finding this fight between the US and China that you do the exchange rate, which is undervalued, try to appreciate. The Chinese, on the other hand, say, we have reduced our trade surplus, but the US trade deficit has not correspondingly declined. So the problem is not the exchange rate of China, but it is somewhere in the US. Therefore, there may be a currency war, and that is a noise which is coming out of Washington. So having said that we have done so well, I'm still keeping my fingers crossed as to what will happen in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be on this panel and to be part of this discussion. And following these presentations by panelists, it's quite interesting to present my point of view because I think there is certain generational gap in this panel, this panelists. And I have to be kind of honest in recognizing that they're coming quite from different generation. But me coming from a country like Georgia that experienced quite few revolutions, number of wars, and tectonic shift of collapse of Soviet Union, I may add few of years to my age and bring some depth to the expertise that I want to discuss. And it's also quite interesting to hear your elaborative and quite in-depth overview of your experiences. And for me, I think it kind of validates one of the points that I wanted to make, that there was significant searching and learning that policymakers have experienced, and you have searched and learned in your lifetime, and you could benefit from years of experience of experiencing various shocks and learning from those. So by that said, I think it's valid to assume that your policy choices are better than it would have been when you were starting your job, say, in 70s or at the beginning of your policy careers. So I fully subscribe to your fourth proposal, that there was quite significant change, and significant change was from learning past experiences and being able to design better macroeconomic policies and better macroeconomic frameworks. And these experiences came from difficult times of crisis, difficult times of understanding what were mistakes, being able to learn from these mistakes and apply new policies and hopefully improved policies. Let me add some drama to Peter's introduction. As he said, low-income countries and emerging markets were able to recover the ground lost during this crisis of 2007 up until now, and they're enjoying levels of growth and level of output. They recovered level of output that was pre-crisis. At the same time, advanced economies may permanently, or at least for some foreseeable future, remain on levels of output that are below pre-crisis levels. So it means that we are going to live in completely different world that will change the weight of economic performance assigned to emerging and developing countries more and less of to advanced economies. So it's a changing environment, and it's a quite shift towards what emerging and developing countries should be playing in the economic future of the world. So what were channels of transmission? Like, what was an impact? What were main channels of transmission of a crisis in advanced economies to developing countries? Transmission channels could have been through financial sector, through export, remittances, and foreign direct investment. Transmission channel through financial sector did not really work in emerging and developing countries, because financial sector there was not that well, was not exposed to the toxic assets. So they were more or less safeguarded from dramatic implications of collapse of mortgage markets in advanced economies. And as my predecessor said, banking in Asia is very much personal. So that kind of created the safeguard of financial sector in many developing countries. Main transmission channel, I think it was through exports and reducing demand from advanced economies to export markets in developing and emerging markets. And here, experience was quite varied, because high-tech producers were impacted the most, because consumers in US needed to get credit to buy those goods that were relatively expensive, while low-end exports have not been impacted because everybody needs to buy garments, and you don't need to get credit to buy those goods. So different countries have had different experiences with exports. A third transmission channel was remittances, and here as well experiences were quite different because countries, and it's mainly African countries that were receiving remittances from European markets have been impacted, while Asian countries have not been impacted significantly, and actually remittances held up quite strong and provided cushion because remitters were more affluent, more kind of richer Asian countries or Gulf states. So remittances also provided very significant cushion. And there was a reduction in FDI from developed world, but I will address this FDI issue later when I talk what are the kind of prospects for future. So in that way, I agree also with my predecessors that we are living in more integrated world than before. Trade links are working, remittances links are working, and one of the advantages one of the kind of safeguards of financial sector in Asia not being impacted by collapse of financial sector in advanced countries was this personal banking business and trying to do things in old-fashioned way and know your clients rather than engage in some sophisticated derivatives market. So that said, summarizing transmission channels, I think it's important to recognize that developed and emerging markets have entered times of turbulence after years and years of macroeconomic stabilization. So they actually had the room to maneuver because their fiscal deficits were tamed and their debt levels were quite low and manageable. Actually, 2/3 of low-income countries have low to moderate rates of external debt distress. And it's quite an achievement because and it came with years of prudent macroeconomic policy management, but also a debt relief. So these countries actually had a room to give fiscal stimulus, because if they were having high levels of debt or unmanageable fiscal deficits, this room would not have been there. So they would not have been able to respond to the challenges of crisis the way they did. And also this crisis came after the increase in food and fuel prices. And with crisis, food and fuel prices dropped, so it allowed room for monetary policy to also become expansionary because inflationary pressures have been released because of reduction in food and fuel prices. So combination of two things, being able to maneuver because you have a fiscal space and being able to maneuver because you have monetary space, gave policymakers in these countries to respond to the challenges of crisis by giving them fiscal stimulus. And this fiscal and monetary stimulus were directed towards export markets. They were also directed towards providing social benefits and stimulating domestic demand. So recovery started with recovery of demand from advanced economies, but at the same time, and it's quite unusual from previous recoveries, it was supported by recovery of domestic demand in emerging and low-income countries. And fact is that people in emerging markets and low-income countries as well are becoming richer. They will be consuming more goods, and it could generate and stimulate domestic demand. That said, this domestic demand cannot really replace reduction in demand from advanced economies, because simply size of advanced economies is overwhelming, and you cannot consumers in like recently rich consumers or recently middle-class consumers in Asia or emerging economies cannot fully replace demand from advanced economy consumers. So it it poses quite big challenges going ahead. How do you respond to this? How do you develop your countries taking into account that you may face permanently lower demand from advanced economies? And I think that will be the biggest question to answer for developing and emerging market policymakers. How do you exit from the stimulus package, from this stimulus mode, and then how do you rebalance your economies from being more reliant on demands from advanced economies towards more domestic markets? And I think answers to those questions are still in working. One of the answers could be greater integration. Like South-South integration is quite strong and providing quite kind of engine and stimulus for development for larger emerging markets. Better regional integration among emerging and developing countries. And I think the biggest challenge that these countries would face is putting down the infrastructure that will help to cushion higher growth path and put them on a higher growth path. And that said, we have to still recognize that these countries are still house for world's most vulnerable, and these policies have to be accompanied with some equitable distribution and social safety net policies that will help alleviate poverty in these countries. So, because just last point that I want to make is that, to summarize also what I was trying to say in my during this period, was that this is going to be a completely different world, and growth engine going to be in developing and emerging markets, and probably it's going to be in Asia, because you have 10%, 9% growth in Asia as a region, and it will attract a lot of capital and draw resources because of this growth benefit, because of this growth differential. Question is, how do you utilize this additional capital inflows, additional interest of investment, better credit ratings that you are enjoying, that developing and emerging markets are enjoying, because of simple reasons that advanced countries' credit ratings have worsened and they have fared much better. So it's a time of opportunity to utilize this potential additional capital flows to these countries to the advantage of investing it in infrastructure and putting those countries in more kind of higher, equitable, more sustainable growth path. Thank you.
Well, before we started, I gave a solemn vow to end on time. I have already broken that vow since we're over time. But I think we need to take, we can probably take one or two questions if they are very quick. All right, so please make them quick. Yes. Or directed at whoever you like.
I'd like to ask a question to...
Can you please stand up so everybody can hear?
What is my opinion on what?
Mercosur.
Sub-regional.
Okay. This is a question about sub-regional free trade agreements, especially in Mercosur and Latin America, correct?
And also Bolivarian movement in general. Now that Venezuelan government has led the Bolivarian movement in Latin America in general.
Yeah. Well, I have been for more than 6 years director of the Institute for Latin American Integration, so I pushed through articles and academic articles for Latin American integration. I think that to the extent that we integrate our economies, but not behind high walls, but just when under low tariff and competitive exchange rates and fiscal surpluses, that will help. That will help because Latin America has relatively, South America, a very large population, big markets, and if we could organize a mutual and systemic expansion of all the economies at the same time, that will be great. There are many problems because we have different currencies, different inflation rates. When the country has different inflation rates, for sure, have different real exchange rates over time. So at sometimes you have enormous deficit in current accounts, sometimes surpluses. So it will be necessary to design some kind of mechanism in order to equilibrate our trade accounts in order for this to work. I have proposed one mechanism which I think is a free market mechanism to equilibrate to the current accounts rather than the trade accounts. And, but nothing of that sort was approved. So I don't think that the Latin American integration is a strong force behind our development. It doesn't contribute too much. What really counts is the individual economic policies of the different countries. Until we do have low inflation, then the possibility of coordinating fiscal and monetary policies, there will be much talk about integration, Bolivar, San Martin, all our heroes, but in practice this will not result in high growth unless the approach is completely different, as I mentioned to you.
Okay, I apologize that we're going to have to end soon. Let's take one more question and we'll stop there. Yes.
Thanks, Peter. Lawrence Egulu, class of 02 CDE. High-powered panelists, just yes or no is the answer I want. Who should we be listening to? The IMF and the World Bank on the one side, or China?
Yes.
You listen to both, but make up your own mind what is good for your own country.
I think that is an excellent note on which to end.